Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone who's joined us for today's webinar with NextWave and Strategy in Action. So thank you for making time, and I hope this is going to be a really interesting session. My name's Tony Clark. I'm founder and CEO at NextWave, and I'll be hosting the webinar this morning alongside two of my colleagues. So what are we going to be talking about? We're going to be talking about the challenges of defining and executing successful strategy in large financial institutions. We want to hear some stories from the sector. We want to dig into the approach to defining your strategy and building a plan and executing on that plan successfully. And we want to share a digital platform approach, which we're very excited about, to framing that whole definition and execution process. So just to introduce my two panelists, alongside me, Ben Davies, who is the Head of Partnerships and Strategy Lecturer from Strategy in Action. Ben, great to have you here.
No, fantastic to be here, and thank you very much. Just to give the very quick 30 seconds on myself. In terms of my background, I was a tennis player in a past life up until about 10 years ago. And then via some studies in the US, I pivoted into the world of consulting and strategy work. So I'm a strategy consultant by trade in the organization which we were, which was a consulting firm. And as we've moved into Strategy in Action, which we'll describe more through this session, I moved into the lead for our partnerships. And then finally, I also do a little bit of work in academia. So as a visiting lecturer in growth and innovation strategy at the London campus of ESCP Business School, which some of you may have come across.
Brilliant, thanks, Ben. And also delighted that we're joined this morning by Rebecca Olsson. Rebecca comes from the industry side, from the financial institution side, having held senior strategy roles in major firms such as UBS, Goldman Sachs, Nordea, and others. And I think it's going to bring a really interesting industry perspective to this morning's conversation. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, great to be here with everyone. And I guess my focus will, having seen a lot of big sort of attempts on strategy and attempts on implementing the strategy, my focus will very much be on the importance of the link of setting the strategy at the beginning, doing the formation, and really following that all the way through the link to the teams that are going to be implementing that strategy for you and the importance of that.
Thanks, Rebecca. So a quick bit of context, just really why we're here together for this morning's session. So NextWave is a digital acceleration consultancy. We're helping financial institutions modernize, principally through technology. As you can see at the top of this picture, the work that we do in the sector is strategy, it's specialist transformation, and it's solutions. Probably 20% of what NextWave is doing is really starting at the strategic end of that life cycle, working with our clients on their strategic priorities and their execution plans. So that's really NextWave. There's a lot more we can tell you about separately, but for this morning's session, we want to get on quickly to talking about strategic approaches. Ben, tell us a little bit about Strategy in Action.
No, thank you. And in terms of Strategy in Action, so Strategy in Action as an organization was born out of our heritage really as a consulting firm. So we were a consulting firm going back around 13, 14, 15 years, a couple of years before I joined the organization. And over the years, we shifted to become what could really be described as a hybrid between a product company, so a digital platform, which we'll go through in this session today, mixed with experts, mixed with consultants and experts from the financial services space, experts from the strategy space, and so on. So through Strategy in Action, we've had the privilege of delivering SiA with a range of organizations, some of which you can see here, including those in financial services, but really across a vast variety of industries. So in the interest of time, I won't go through these one by one, but that's just a little bit on where we've come from as an organization, and we'll be digging more into what Strategy in Action delivers in partnership with NextWave through this webinar.
Thanks, Ben. And really just to explain, working together, the Strategy in Action platform provides a digital framework for strategy definition and execution, and the NextWave team provides the industry domain depth and experience to help our clients build and deliver their strategies. And what we really like about the platform, hopefully this will come through as you see a bit more of the conversation this morning, is that this is a framework approach that's been tried and tested. What Ben didn't say, which I think might be interesting for this audience, is that the platform underpinned the London Stock Exchange elite program for several years, and the growth firms that were in that pre-IPO cohort all went through the process, and so this is, and it's also been used with the likes of Ferrari and other logos, really multi-sector, but some major financial institutions as well. So this is tried and tested. Anyhow, lots to talk about. So let's move on. So we thought we'd start with strategy as a definition. And the reason we thought that would be interesting and important is because from our travels, the definitions, the interpretations of that word strategy do differ across firms. They probably differ if you were to ask across your firm. What does it really mean? And sometimes I think strategy is interpreted more as a statement of intent or as a destination, and sometimes it's more action-oriented, more execution-oriented. This is the definition that we really like. This is the definition that we work to, that strategy is a set of creative, sustainable, coordinated actions. So a plan to overcome one or more core challenges to deliver value. It's a bit of a mouthful, but once you think about it, it's actually about addressing those challenges. They might be growth, efficiency, control, risk and control. Everything our clients do really falls into those three buckets. And what are the actions? What's your path to deliver on those goals to add value to the organization? So I'll pause there. Ben, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, so and obviously this is more of an academic, almost a slightly academic definition of what strategy is, which I think is bang on the money. But for me, the way in which I really think about it, which is maybe a little bit more colloquial, is strategy is how you plan to bridge the gap between where you are today and where you want to be. But strategy also includes the elements of understanding where are you today and also understanding where do you want to be. And everything that sits within that is the execution piece. So for me, really, that's the way in which I think about it, is just building a really good understanding of what we ultimately want to go and do, what we ultimately want to go and achieve, and then having the plan in place and having the structure in place and having the actions, as it says here, in place in order to go and make it a reality. Now, the real challenge that I've seen, whether it's in the sporting world or in the business world or whatever it may be, is also the execution piece, is the people on the ground making it happen. But that's the way that I generally really think about it.
That's great. Rebecca, real world perspective from the financial institutions, perhaps?
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of what Ben said echoes for me, because it's about setting a strategy that's anchored in reality. The worst you can do in my book is to put theoretical and big frame words that many in the organization and big institutions don't understand, don't have time to understand. And then I think the other thing is also about, as Ben said, is about linking it end to end, so people really understand in implementations that can often in big institutions run year on year, how it links back, how you stay on course, how do we know that we're still achieving the strategy that we set out, and are there adjustments and changes to that strategy as we move on and we learn more. And I think that is key in institutions. The other thing I would say, just sort of real world on setting strategy, I think financial services companies are in many cases, as we know, very large and complex organizations with multiple different business lines, different products, many customer segments, and then therefore also competing visions amongst the senior stakeholders. So, an example could be customer versus product growth, market share, wallet share, and there's then tensions in the organization. So this can mean that it is often very difficult to set a strategy that will be implementable if it affects many different areas in the organization. So that's one of the big challenges, I think, of bigger financial institutions.
Yeah, and I think we've all seen that in various forms with big programs that have had sort of, one bank initiatives or macro transformation objectives, which have ultimately under delivered. So it's a nice segue actually to the next topic: developing your strategy. What are some of the challenges? And I'm sure this is going to resonate with those in the audience, with setting strategy and delivering on it. Ben?
Yeah, and this is just the most typical challenges that we see of developing strategy. And of course, there are many that sit as subsets of this and cascade down through the organization. But generally for organizations, strategy first and foremost is very expensive. So whether it's expensive in the sense of capital, of money, in terms of bringing consultants and sitting with them, or whether it's expensive in terms of having to employ individuals and build a strategy team internally, it's a capital intensive activity, and it's also time consuming. So again, whether it's going and working with consultants or whether it's doing it in-house or a variety of those, a combination of those two factors, it's a very time consuming activity that involves detailed planning. And finally, it can be of little impact, or it can be very difficult to track return on investment, because strategy can often sit with just a few people within an organization. It could be owned by one or two individuals, and it can be disconnected from those throughout the team, whether that's at the management level, as we'll see in a few minutes, whether it's down to the very, very front lines. And unless you have that connection of the strategy throughout the organization, from top to bottom and also bottom to top, then it can be, as it says here, of little impact. So they're really the three main challenges that we see. It can be very expensive, it can be very time consuming, and as a result of that, it can sometimes be of little impact for an organization. So that's what we need to overcome.
Rebecca, any comments?
No, not more to add there. It rings very true.
Okay.
So yeah, with that in mind, we have just a couple of insights, and we'll make this fairly quick so we can get into the meat of the discussion today. But the first insight, which rings very, very true and is incredibly pertinent, is the fact that we live in what we call a VUCA world. So a VUCA world, as you can see there, VUCA, stands for a world which is very volatile, very uncertain, very complex, and very ambiguous. And then we live in a world which is becoming increasingly VUCA, is becoming increasingly volatile, increasingly uncertain, and so on. So we're moving from a world which had fairly infrequent disruptions, as you can see on the left-hand side of the slide here, which had disconnected systems, working with small data, as well as people who worked for a living, people who got a job and they stayed within that. And we're moving towards a world, or I would argue that we have completely moved towards a world where we have very frequent disruptions, whether that's on a geopolitical level, whether that's on from a business standpoint. We have truly hyper-connected systems. So hyper-connected systems to the extent that a cargo ship in a canal, well, a canal, but significantly larger than that, halfway around the world, can affect global supply chains, whether it's down to PCBs, so electrical controllers, all the way through to people receiving furniture. And we live in a world of truly big data, of connected systems globally, as well as individuals who work for organizations that work for a purpose. So that last bullet point there, we've moved from a world in which people, as I said, get a job in accounting or get a job in finance, and they stay in that for the entirety of their lives or their working lives, to a world where people want to be connected to the ethos of an organization. They want to be connected to altruistically, what is that organization trying to achieve? What does that organization stand for? And that's something that we've seen to become more and more important. So this is the world in which we inhabit, and this makes strategy work more challenging. It makes it more complex, but that's the reality.
Yeah, as you said here, making strategic choices becomes more difficult. I would add one, which is that everything's happening more quickly. So yes, this is why NextWave's a digital acceleration consultancy. We're helping our clients do things more quickly, whether that's automating processes for efficiency or taking new products to market, and many other things that we could talk about. But and we've seen it with the advent of generative AI for the enterprise, the pace of uptake and now experimentation at enterprise level, and so some of those use cases starting to come out. It's ever increasing. So keeping pace with the world and with that environment is a huge challenge, and probably one that's only going to get more difficult, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Insight number 2.
Yes, and this is describing the challenge and also the requirement to cascade strategy down through an organization. So this slide here actually comes from an MIT study, and this one's 2018, but there's an updated one. They generally run it every 4 years or so. And it's looking at the percentage of leaders, so business leaders at each level in an organization, who can list their company's top 3 priorities. So the top 3 strategic priorities. So from this survey here, at the top team, so the very top level, C-suite, CEO, CFO, and so on, generally it's around 50%. So 1 in 2 of those top leaders who can list their company's top 3 priorities. But as we cascade it down through an organization, as we go to senior executives, as we go to middle managers, as we go to frontline supervisors, and as a reminder, senior executives, middle managers, and frontline supervisors, they're all still leaders. They're all still managing other people. They're all still driving the organization. The percentage drops off significantly. So at senior executive level, it's about 1 in 5. By the time we get to the very front line, by the time we get to the shop floor, by the time we get to the coal face of an organization, it's just above 1 in 10. It's 13%. And the challenge here is that unless you have leaders within your organization who are clear on what the organization is ultimately trying to achieve, what we're actually doing day to day, month to month, year to year, how are they then able to communicate that and cascade that and engage those in their team throughout the entirety of the organization? So that's the significant challenge, is as we drop down, and even at the top team level, 50% is nowhere near high enough. But as we drop down through an organization, the understanding of the strategy, the understanding of what we're trying to do, drops significantly. And that's a real challenge. And that can increase costs, that can lead to significantly worse results, and ultimately it impacts on the success of a strategy.
I would also add to this and say it's perhaps it could be that the people in the organization will know what the strategy is or what the top 3 priorities in, because they will have seen that on their website, and they'll have seen that in corporate communication. But they might not always relate to it, and they might not always see what they do day to day, how that relates to those 3 statements that their corporate communications have put out. And I think that's one of the key things, is that sometimes they may know, but they don't know what they do to actually impact that and affect what the company is trying to do.
Definitely so.
Yeah, so having a common set of objectives that people actually understand and can relate to, and really bring that into reality in the context of their roles and their position in the organization.
Absolutely so.
Okay, so that's a nice link to, so where do you start building or defining your company's mission and vision? And I think that you can't understate the importance of having a clear mission and vision in setting your direction. Ben?
Definitely so. Yeah, definitely so. And thanks, Tony. And strategy is fantastic, and it's great to talk about our priorities, and it's great to talk about our KPIs and what markets we're going to enter and what's the size of this market and so on. But unless it's anchored in where we ultimately want to go, what we ultimately want to achieve, it's never going to have impact, because we don't actually understand what we're trying to drive towards. What's the ultimate goal? What are we going to try to make happen? And vision and mission is just that. Vision and mission is the ultimate goal at the tip of the pyramid of our strategy, if we think about it in that way. So a vision is a vivid statement that describes the future state of the organization. So it's our North Star. It's what we ultimately want to go and achieve. And this should be an inspirational and also aspirational goal, an inspirational, aspirational statement for the organization of where we want to go. Mission, on the other hand, is related to the core purpose. It's related to the reason for being of an organization. So why do we actually exist? What are we here to do? Sometimes it's described as the raison d'etre, the reason for being, or the reason for existence. So these are the 2 elements that we need to put in place that ultimately anchor the strategy in terms of, this is what we stand for, and this is what we want to go and achieve.
Do you have some examples?
We do have a couple of examples. So we've got a few very varied examples, let's say. But these are great examples, and these aren't designed to be best practices. These aren't designed to be, this is how you should build your vision statement, for example. But it's just a nice instance. It's a nice example of of how some companies have gone about it. So the first example here is from Sony, which is an organization I'm sure everybody knows, of course. And this is from Sony's vision statement in 1950, so just post Second World War, obviously the time where Japan as a country was going through extreme change. It was coming off the back of large-scale destruction of industry. And Sony put this vision statement forward. They said, we will create products that become pervasive around the world. We will be the first Japanese company to go into the US market and distribute directly. We will succeed with innovations that US companies have failed at, such as the transistor radio. 50 years from now, our brand name will be as well known as any in the world and will signify innovation and quality that rival the most innovative companies anywhere. Made in Japan will mean something fine, not something shoddy. So what's interesting about this vision statement is it's very wordy, it's very lengthy, of course, but it's very, very detailed. It's very, very specific. So within this, we already start to be able to pick out and understand KPIs, key performance indicators, or even priorities. So you see here, they talk about time horizons. They say 50 years from now. They talk about areas such as innovation. They talk about areas such as quality. They even talk about specific products and also routes to market. In the US, transistor radio. And we could argue, and I think I would agree, that 50 years from this, so in the year 2000, they did achieve the majority of these goals. They were one of the most well-known organizations globally. They were and still are signifying innovation and quality. But this is an example of a very detail-oriented, very specific, and probably of the time vision statement as well.
Yeah, I think it's super powerful, and you can sort of reflect back on everything that Sony have done since, and how it's sort of driving towards this objective.
Definitely so. Now,
I think you've got another one as well, haven't you?
The other example we have is a little bit different. So you can obviously instantly see that it's much shorter. And this vision statement, which wasn't the formal vision statement of an organization, but it was still a vision statement. This came from JFK. So this came from President John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s. So the outset of that decade. And JFK was at an event at one of the NASA sites, and he was giving a speech. And he said this statement, which was, we will put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. Now, this is a true vision statement for that organization, because that organization at the time, NASA, were in the midst of the space race in the absolute depths of the Cold War, competing against the Soviet Union to put a man on the moon. And as part of that, there were challenges internally. They said, look, it's going to take 15 years. It's going to take 20 years. There are certain things we technically can't do. And JFK put it forward and said, no, the vision is we will put a man on the moon before the end of the decade, with a very, very clear objective, a very, very clear inspirational goal, and a very clear time horizon. And they did. They did put a man on the moon before the end of the decade, 1969. They did achieve their goals. But a nice little story that speaks to how strong and pervasive a vision statement can be through an organization is that, and some of you may know this, a couple of years later, JFK was at another NASA site, and he was touring and shaking hands and doing all the things that politicians do. And as he was doing so, he was going down one of the corridors past a line of people, and he comes across one chap who's stood there, and he goes over and shakes his hand and says, oh, very nice to meet you. So what do you do here? And the man says, oh, I'm the janitor. I clean the toilets. I clean the floors. I'm helping to put a man on the moon. So it shows that when you have such a strong inspirational, aspirational vision for what you want to achieve, it really permeates and cascades down and integrates itself within the heart and soul of an organization. So much so that even someone who respectfully cleans the toilets and mops the floors feels like they are really part of this vision of, in this case, putting a man on the moon.
Everyone can polarize around the same objectives. I'm going to add a couple of nice little stories to this. Earlier in my career, it's almost 20 years ago, I worked for one of the Virgin businesses during the dot-com boom, and this was about online e-commerce. And Richard Branson's famous for this, putting these objectives out there and saying, hey, we're going to go live with something in November, which in this case, the rest of the organization was not ready for. And there was a lot of running around just to meet, but it was all pulling in the same direction, and we got there. Having a clear vision and mission statement that everyone can line up with, it just galvanizes the organization at every level. If we bring this back to sector, to financial services, just a couple of examples. So I don't always like to go sort of pick one of the big brands, but JP Morgan aims to be the best financial services firm in the world, and they want to do that by leveraging their rich heritage and their strong platform. And that's a pretty clear statement. And their mission is to enable people to contribute from a growing economy. And then if you look across what they're actually doing, investing in digital innovation and a global footprint and customer-centric and a risk, you can sort of see how all the initiatives line up. There are lots of examples across the sector, some more successful than others, of setting those signposts and then laying out a strategic plan to get there. NextWave's vision and mission is to be the leading digital acceleration consultancy in financial services, and our mission is building businesses for the next generation. And if you go and ask our team, why are they doing what they're doing, we won't test it on this session, but I would hope very many of them would tell you, why they're with NextWave and how that lines up to this mission of building businesses for the next generation, whether that's creating opportunity in our clients' organizations, modernizing the businesses that we work with, and indeed the opportunities that we get from building our own growing organization. Anyway, I could go on. There's lots more examples. Rebecca, any comments on vision and mission before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to where I started with sort of bigger, complex organizations, 25, 30, 40,000 people. I very much see the vision and mission to ensure everyone stays moving towards that North Star, as Ben mentioned. And that, of course, reduces the risk of teams and people splintering off in different directions. So we all know strategy doesn't run on a straight road, and there's a lot of twists and turns along the way. But the vision and mission really ensures everyone knows what the final destination is and how we're going to get there in the Sony example. Yeah. And then I would also say that many here vision and mission, kind of where we started on the whole, company purpose and the corporate communication. A vision and mission can live on a corporate landscape, but very much can live on a business line level, can live on a functional level, and so on. So it's something that can be used and translated and created at many different levels of the organization, depending on the purpose of that area.
Yeah, I think it's super important. I mean, you're not always talking about whole of organization, and those divisions, those function level elements of the firm, where they do have that clear direction, those are often the ones that are more successful in hitting the objectives for that particular part of the business. Okay, so company's purpose is their mission.
Yes,
a few more examples here, Ben.
Yeah, let's just look at a couple of examples here, and I'll move through this fairly quickly because the next slide after this is really the key one to tie it all together. But here we just have a couple of examples of company missions, some of which are current, some of which are older missions, which we've picked out for specific reasons. The few that I'm just going to call out now are actually numbers 3 and 4 because they're at opposite ends of the spectrum, and let's take a look why. So number 4 first is Nike, again, of course, a brand that everyone knows. And Nike's mission is to experience the emotion of competition, winning and crushing competitors. So the interesting thing here is there is no mention of clothing. There is no mention of shoes. There's no mention of running shoes, which is where Phil Knight started out before Nike became Nike. It is purely tying into what do they want to communicate? What do they believe their reason for being is? And that is to experience the emotion of competition, winning and crushing competitors. Now, if we contrast and compare that to number 3, just above it, which is McKinsey. McKinsey's mission is the opposite end of the spectrum. I'm not saying either one is better or worse, but McKinsey's mission actually has 2 parts to it. So McKinsey's mission is to help our clients make distinctive, lasting, and substantial improvements in their performance and to build a great firm that is able to attract, develop, excite, and retain exceptional people. Now, despite sounding like this was written by consultants, which I'm sure it was, and Nike's was written by very different individuals, the interesting part about McKinsey is those two components. And the two components are external and internal. So they have an externally facing component, which is to help our clients make distinctive, lasting, and substantial improvements in their performance. It's talking about what are they on this planet for? What do they do in terms of serving clients? What do they stand for? And then they have an internal component to build a great firm that is able to attract, develop, excite, and retain exceptional people. So it's looking internally at their employees, at their teams, at those that are pushing McKinsey forward. And it's speaking to both of those, external and internal. So this is just a couple of examples, but of course there are others as well that we could go through.
Yeah, okay. So let's keep moving for vision and mission. That's where it starts, but there's a lot more to unpack.
Exactly. And so the final perfect. The final component of this, which we're going to jump into, and then we're going to connect it to, is how does vision and mission begin to become cascaded down through the organization? How does it become real and concrete? And it becomes real and concrete by connecting to something that we call the level of ambition. So just before I go through these components, the challenge with vision and mission is it's completely interpretable. So if I say my vision statement for my illustrative, completely made up hypothetical manufacturing company is to become the #1 player in the UK market, that means something very, very different to me, as it means to Rebecca, as it means to Tony, as it means to all of you. Because #1 player in the UK market could be by revenue. It could be by number of units sold. It could be by market share. It could be by customer NPS. So what the level of ambition does is it transforms the vision and mission into something which is very real and concrete for the entire organization. So the level of ambition is the translation, is the transformation of our vision and mission into quantifiable, measurable KPIs. So key performance indicators. And the way in which we do that is we take components of the vision and mission. So if it's Sony talking about quality, if it's Sony talking about innovation, if it's Sony talking about market share, we then build specific KPIs that link directly to the vision and mission and that we can actually track. And this supports an organization, the final point here and why is it so important, it supports an organization in being fully aligned and fully understanding what does the destination actually look like and how do we track if we're being successful or not. So this is tying together vision, mission, and level of ambition. In this slide here, and just to move for time, because otherwise I think we'll get caught up in lots of conversation. This slide here is really one of the most key ones that I would urge everyone to really try to take in if possible. This is the way in which we think about strategy and we think about how strategy cascades down through an organization. So we think about strategy almost like a pyramid, and you have that pyramid here. At the very, very tip of that pyramid, you have a few broad commitments to action. This is what we ultimately want to go and achieve. This is where we want to go. And we call that, as you can see here, the vision, the mission, and the level of ambition. It's what we've discussed in the last 20, 30 minutes or so. But how do we make it real? How do we cascade it down through an organization? How do you actually make the vision, mission, level of ambition happen? Well, you do that through what we call strategic and enabling priorities, that second layer. And strategic enabling priorities are the big pieces that you put in place to steer the ship where you want it to go. It's how you bridge the gap between where you are today and where you want to be. Now, this often takes place within what we call the strategic plan, as you can see on the left-hand side here. The strategic plan is longer term. It's often looking at the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, depending on the industry. But the challenge is the disconnect between the strategy and the execution. And we call that, as you can see in the bottom left here, the operating plan. So how do we make our strategic enabling priorities happen? We do so through what we call strategic initiatives. Strategic initiatives are those that feed the priorities, that cascade down through the organization at the tactical level, that help us to operationalize the strategy. And then finally, we want to track those. We want to understand how we're doing in terms of hitting our targets. How are we doing in terms of executing our strategy? Do we need to make any changes, any refinements? And we call that the bottom layer there, which are monthly, could be quarterly, and could be annual progress reviews. So ultimately, we're going from a few big, broad commitments to action at the very, very top. We will put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. all the way through to the strategic enabling priorities related to engineering, related to the astronauts themselves in this example, all the way through to the small initiatives, which could be the development of very specific components, for example, all the way through to the tracking on a monthly, quarterly, and annual basis of if we're hitting our targets or not. So many specific commitments to action. And this, for me anyway, ultimately sums up what strategy development is and what strategy execution is, and how we should think about cascading it down through an organization. I don't know, Tony, Rebecca, if you have any further thoughts on this specifically.
I was just going to pick up on Rebecca's point from a few minutes ago, actually. So you can look at this framework and say, okay, whole of firm. So take the big bank example, want to be the world's best bank. But actually, if you're the finance function, what does it mean for you? Well, perhaps you want to, your KPIs might be take 5 days off the month-end close. They might be to move from a largely manual finance function to one that's 50% automated. They might be to improve the quality of the financial reporting to the regulator, and any number of other KPIs. But the same framework always applies. So you'd have a set of vision and mission statements and a measurable level of ambition for whole of function, and that then cascades to, in that finance example, perhaps a set of initiatives around automation of key processes, around normalizing workflows, and a number of other things, improving data quality, etc. And it cascades down to an operating plan, a strategy execution program, so a set of initiatives that can be measured, all of which ultimately then rolls up to support the company's vision and mission. And I think that's the way that we can think about this for whole of function or division that actually sits under the umbrella goals of the organization. Rebecca, I think you look like you were about to add something to that, but do jump in.
No, I mean, I very much agree, and I have, through my experience, I've seen a lot of good and bad examples of where this works and where it doesn't work. So I can start maybe with a good example of why you need to really focus on that vision, mission, and level of ambition. There's an example from one of the firms I worked in where we were looking at a change to a business offering, and in this example, the vision and strategic outcome was very well understood and was a recurring topic in the C-suite discussions, but they couldn't get traction to move forward with the high-level vision and the outcomes alone. But once you spent more time on this, which I think Ben will go into in the next segment, once you've done your internal landscape, once you figure out how your cost and income ratio look, whatever those points are that you need to assess to validate that this vision and mission is actually the way you need to go. Once those things were done and that internal alignment was achieved, and external analysis was done to show competitors was thinking the same changes, it was important perhaps to be a first mover. The combination of those two then made that strategy achievable and made that strategy to be anchored in the organization and for all owners to get behind it. So there's elements of this connection where you need to spend a little bit more time to get the right outcome. I've also seen other examples, and I think this goes more into the operational plan, is that strategy and ambition can be well defined at the beginning and can be well planned. But with multi-year transformations, this can often get lost over time. So then that means that individual teams further down in the organization that are responsible for that implementation can veer off course, which is kind of what we talked about in the beginning. And the change of this direction is often not visible to senior leadership, or not fully engaged and following through the implementation, so following through that pyramid from top to bottom. And in this case, the loss of focus on these strategic outcomes led to the delivery missing very key deadlines and years of delivery time, resources, cost being written off. And then as a side, there was also a lack of awareness of external dependencies, which realization came later that if these deadlines had been kept, there wouldn't have been such a challenge to also meet what was coming externally, and had very negative outcomes for the organization. So it's very important to really connect top to bottom, bottom to top, as Ben said, continuously evaluate and stay close to the implementation of these ambitions.
Brilliant. Okay, so how do we fill in all the layers? How do we make all the connections? How do we keep it continuous? How do we harness the organization actively on delivering on the strategy? So let's go a level lower. So the sort of final third of this morning's session, we want to unpack strategic approach at a more practical level. So this one's going to go over to Ben, who is going to show us the strategy and action platform, which is a digital platform for capturing and driving all of the things we've just been talking about. And then we'll just come back and we'll have a short discussion around how that applies to some of the real life examples that we've been talking about.
Yep, definitely. So I think if you just stop sharing for a moment, Tony, and then I can share my screen. Just bear with me one moment. There we go. And share. So with any luck, everyone should now see the platform. Maybe someone just give me a head nod for that. Thank you, Tony. Great. So this is the strategy and action platform. So this is what sits at the heart and soul of how we, and by we I mean NextWave with strategy and action, support organizations in developing, in executing, and then in monitoring their strategic plan. This isn't the only way to do strategy work, but this is really just a collective, an amalgamation of the best practices, the gold standards of conduct this type of work, and put into a platform to support with a lot of the heavy lifting. So within this, you can see some of the elements that we've talked through throughout this session. So within the strategy and action platform here, you can see the three components that we actually just described in that pyramid. So from vision, mission, and level of ambition through to strategic scenarios, this is the strategy formulation component. So this is where organizations define, what do we ultimately want to go and achieve? What are the fact-based, data-driven insights that drive those decisions? And then what are the priorities, what are the choices we put in place in order to bridge the gap between where we are today and where we want to be? The second component, these orange tiles down here of the initiatives planning and the budget, this is your strategy execution piece. So this is where, as we like to say to organizations, you go from talking the talk to walking the walk. This is where we make it happen. This is where we operationalize the strategy down to a tactical level. And then finally, you have this gray, somewhat blue tile down here called the progress review. And this is your PMO. This is where you track the progress, you monitor the successful or sometimes unsuccessful execution of the strategy, and you decide, what do we keep? What do we kill? What do we change? What do we add? So how do we refine and iterate the strategic plan and the execution plan in order to be more successful moving forward? So today we've discussed really vision, mission, and level of ambition, which sits within this component here. The output of that, which I'll just show you very quickly, is called the strategy in a page. So for this company, which is an illustrative, completely hypothetical food company based in the Nordics, they have their vision very clearly laid out, the inspirational future state of the organization. They have their mission, their reason for being, and they've transformed that into their top level, most critical KPIs in terms of financially driven KPIs, revenue, gross margin, EBITDA, ROIC, as well as non-financial KPIs related to the percentage of packaging that's recycled, related to the number of countries they're present in, even through to their net promoter score, as well as their employee net promoter score. How well are they taking care of their people, their teams? So this becomes that one page of that strategy in a page, which lays out for the entire organization. This is what we want to go and achieve. This is how we measure it. And then finally, this is where we are today in terms of a quantified number, a concrete number. And this is where we want to be. This isn't their budget, but this is the inspirational goal. This is the inspirational future state of the organization that they want to go and achieve. So today in this webinar, we've discussed really that part: vision, mission, level of ambition. There are, of course, all the other components which drive formulation of the strategy, the execution of the strategy, and then the tracking of the strategy. And this, the strategy action platform, is just the digital, it's the tech tool to support the process, collaboratively delivered by experts, by the NextWave team, who co-create the strategy with organizations. So they own it. So it's not just handed to them. And that's what strategy action is. That's the tech, that's the platform that sits below it. I don't know, Tony, Rebecca, anything to add to this whilst I have the platform here up on the screen?
No, I think that I feel like I've said it probably a few times before, but I think that the beauty of this is really that it connects strategy all the way through in a, I dare to say, automated fashion. It lives in one place. You can see what happens when you change further down the implementation to see, does this relate back to those core business outcomes, those core measures that we defined in the beginning, and vice versa. And I think that's really the power of this in one place.
Absolutely, sir.
Yeah, and I would say there's a huge amount of depth to this framework, which isn't really for this morning's session. But the logical life cycle through the strategy definition process and then through to an operating plan that can be executed and measured is underpinned. Behind each of these tiles, you start with defining your field of play, your footprint, looking at internal capabilities and where you think you have competitive advantage, looking at the external market and what the enablers and drivers are. So all of those things that strategy people talk about, sort of Porter's 5 forces and strategic drivers and scenarios, are encapsulated in the framework. So this then allows an organization to step through filling out their configuration, their specifics, their level of ambition and KPIs, and then leveraging the inputs and data at each stage into the subsequent pieces, so it all pulls through. And then ultimately you get an operating plan and a set of scenarios, sort of stretch target scenario and base case or worst case, the different paths the organization could take that pulls through all the numbers and all of the analysis that precedes it. Yeah, and Ben's sharing a few pictures.
This is, as you said, unfortunately, we don't have the time in this to go through the full details of this because we'd be here for an hour to 5. But this is just another of those outputs, those end products. This is showing the scenarios, so the financial simulation component. What do we ultimately want to achieve? Their level of ambition was 2.5 billion in this case. And here we can see the ambitious scenario, which is the impact to their strategy, but also we can see the baseline scenario, which has been projected. This is from a revenue standpoint. So if they just float with the market, as well as the worst case scenario, what happens if they don't respond to the market threats? So there's a significant level of granularity, a significant level of understanding and depth that we go into through this process, because ultimately the better armed we are with insights, with data-driven and fact-based understanding, the better decisions we can make. We then need to execute, which comes down to the next component of the operating plan and the progress review. But the better we plan here, the better we understand here, the more likely we are to execute effectively and ultimately be successful.
And these are the things that if you've grown up in strategic initiatives with big firms, often just sit on a fragment of a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint somewhere, and they're disconnected and they're out of date by the time they're used. The platform brings all of this together and really forces you to configure the data points at each stage in order to be able to leverage it in context and correctly at the stages that follow, which makes that. And then of course you can crowdsource inputs and collaborate across your colleagues across the organization. So it just becomes a very powerful single platform for the whole strategic life cycle. And it goes without saying that, of course, it doesn't just work for food companies. So NextWave have developed NextBank and other financial institution scenarios on the platform, which we'd be very happy to discuss, of course, with anyone in today's audience who wants to dig into this a bit further as an accelerator and enabler for their own strategic programs. We can have those discussions in context as a follow-on. Be delighted to do that.
Definitely. So I'll stop sharing my screen as well, just in the interest of time, and I'll hand it back to you, Tony, if you want to share again.
Yeah, I think we've just got a picture or two to close.
Yes.
So
there we go.
And we want to leave a minute or two for questions as well. So I think we've talked about this in broad terms.
We've talked about this in quite a lot of detail here, but this is just another quick reminder of those three predominant elements. So the strategy formulation piece, building the strategy, the operating plan, executing the strategy, and then the progress review, monitoring and iterating the strategy. And the purpose of this is that strategy shouldn't be a static binary exercise that's completed every 3 years or 5 years and 10 years. It should be a living, breathing, and organic entity in essence, where we build, we execute, but it's a continuous and iterative process in order to understand how successful we're being or not. And this here, we can jump to the next slide. This here is just an example of some of those key components throughout the process, from vision, mission, level of ambition, where we define what we ultimately want to achieve, through to the playing field, that second tile there, that second module, which is where we understand two areas. Where do we play today and where could we play? We have the internal analysis. The internal analysis is really where we see what sits under the hood. So we pinpoint what is our value proposition. We understand what our strengths and weaknesses are. External analysis, which is where we go and look at the market sizing, Porter's 5 forces, what are the trends at play, what's the growth rate of the market, all the way through to priorities and scenarios. What are we ultimately actually going to do? How do we bridge the gap? And what's the financial simulation of the strategic plan? And from there, we move through to initiatives planning, which is the tactical piece of it. It's the operationalizing the strategy and the progress review, as we discussed before. But I know Tony and Rebecca, I'll throw it to you guys for any further input on this, or specifically for financial services as well.
Yeah, I think just in interest of time, we do want to leave a few minutes for questions. But I think we talked at length about the strategy definition and why that is important, and the linking all the way through. Some of the things that I find are really important here, and also a way to visualize where the sort of the priorities meet the strategy, is in the strategic priorities section. That's when you start bridging your mission, all the information that you understand about where you want to go. You've had that anchored. Then you move into what are those building blocks to get to that strategy? What needs to be in place to get to that strategy and those business outcomes? And I think this framework also has some very nice visuals that are ready to use in different ways of cascading and communicating this to our organization, and also to really play back, does this work for the organization? Doing the strategic scenarios, the modeling, not just about financial modeling per se on revenue, as we saw earlier on best case and worst case, but what is the best case if we get all the funding and the management attention, and the priorities stay the same for multi-years? But what happens if we get no funding? The world keeps changing, we become more stale, and we're not equipped to manage with the changing environment around us. What does that worst case look like? And so on. And again, creating those visuals, creating that modeling and that visuals is a very powerful tool to really communicate the impacts that could be there if the strategy is not worked on, or veers off course over time. And I think we have a lot of those visuals as well that we can show to you as well.
There's a few hanging off the picture here, and I think, of course, folks can make their own choices about the platforms they might use to frame their strategy. But from the NextWave perspective, these days there's a digital platform for everything, and there's a reason for that. It's because it dramatically improves efficiency and data-driven process, and this is that same principle applied to the strategic planning and execution process. And I think whichever platform firms take, whether they use a platform at all, they're going to go through these stages, and this is what you need to do if you're going to have a cohesive strategy that stands up to scrutiny from the board and actually shows you the scenarios and the costs and the benefits involved with your plan. So I would urge everyone to, if this is sort of in your space, to take a closer look. What I would say, just as we're closing, because I think we've got just 5 minutes or so.
There's a couple of questions there as well, yeah.
Yeah, so there are a couple of questions that have come through, and indeed, if you've got any questions from the audience, now's the time. Type them into the Q&A panel, and we can address those quickly. So we've been asked, are we going to have another webinar to complete the whole strategy framework? So I think with interest in that, the answer will be absolutely. Be delighted to do that. I think we also asked whether we would share the slides, which of course we can send those to all the attendees after the session. So I'm just looking to see if there's any other questions that have come through.
Maybe just whilst we wait a moment, if there are any other questions that come through, just quickly describe what we see on the screen here, maybe if a couple of people are typing. So on the screen here, and it's quite small, but each of those little boxes that you see, which are coming off vision, mission, level of ambition, for example, are coming off of our playing field and so on. These are the outputs that organizations actually build. So on the far left or the top left there, you can see, and again, it's very small, but you can see the strategy in a page, which is the one that we looked at in the platform before. But within the playing field there, that's the market matrix. That's where organizations understand and define where do you play today and where could you play, all the way through to, on the right-hand side, those very detailed strategic outputs, those very detailed priorities and financial simulations which are developed on, for example, the revenue bridge, on the strategic scenarios in terms of the best case, worst case, all the way through to, for example, the income statement. And then the outputs continue all the way through to the initiatives planning. So the orange tiles at the bottom there, which is the execution piece. So it builds out that Gantt chart style output for an organization to drive and to understand from a strategic planning level, what are we actually trying to do? What are the initiatives? When do they take place? And so on, all the way through to the progress review. So I think there's another question, which is, how critical is it to connect vision and mission statements to KPIs? Thank you for the question. I mean, Tony, Rebecca, happy if you want to jump in, or I can take it as you prefer.
I would say it's fundamental, but Ben, interested? Your view?
Yeah, I mean, it's really the absolute premise of this conversation, of this webinar. So vision and mission statements are fantastic, and we have lots of conversation with companies that say, we have our vision and mission statement. It's very, very well defined, but really it's just nice narrative. It's just nice storytelling, unless it's connected to action, unless it's connected to quantifiable measures that we can actually track. So for me, it's absolutely critical. It's one of the most pertinent points, is that we need to connect vision and mission to KPIs, to those that we can actually track. And that's why in this process, it's one of the very first things that we do.
And I would add to that is really a way of checking how well are you delivering towards the goals that were set out. Otherwise, you might be delivering against a different set of goals. So it is absolutely important to link to those KPIs.
And there's a question that came alongside, perhaps from same person. How do organizations avoid focusing too heavily on financial KPIs? And I think that's an interesting point. It's really important to have a balanced set of KPIs, but the financials are very important, and they are in here. Actually, when we first looked at strategy and action, one of the things that struck me was that if you're doing this at whole of corporate level, not necessarily the case if you're doing a support function like a finance function, but when you do whole of corporate level, the first thing you do here is load up the P&L and the balance sheet for the firm, and then those numbers are available and drive the various scenarios that follow. So this strategy definition and delivery framework is very much in the real world context of the numbers of the organization. However, when you build the KPIs out, you absolutely have to have a balanced set of KPIs that are driving other measurables, whether they are NPS scores or attrition rates or growth rates or whatever it is, rather than purely on the financials themselves.
I think we had maybe just time for the last question from Paolo, which is a very good question, which is, where does the creativity kick in? And my 20 seconds on this would be, the creativity sits throughout the entirety of this process, and that's why it's not an AI or fully automated tool where we plug in some numbers and we say generate the best strategy possible. It's a hybrid between technology, so the platform, and people. But the people are the key element of this, because the people need to be creative in terms of what is our vision, what is our mission, what does it actually mean to us, what are our KPIs, what are the decisions that we take, creative in terms of the markets we may move into or in terms of problem solving. So for me, the creativity sits throughout the entirety of this. It's just that the platform, the technology, does a lot of the heavy lifting that sits behind the scenes.
It's a great question, because looking at what we've presented, one might think, oh, this has all been entirely parameterized, and not so. I think what this gives you is a creative sandbox, but with some guide rails, so that you actually create a strategy that is fully formed and is includes the right elements. So there's a huge amount of creativity when you work through this. Really, what the platform is doing is creating that environment to foster those inputs and that definition process.
I think we're running up against time, as
we are.
as the expectation.
But look, it's great to be taking a bunch of questions at this stage. What I would say, if any of you on the audience here want to continue the conversation more directly, so if you want to have one-to-one with any of the panel here on your goals and ambitions, or how to use this framework and platform approach in greater detail, just put a yes in the Q&A, and then we'll know, so we can contact you after the session, or indeed just reach out directly. But if you want to flag that in the Q&A, we'd be more than happy to have an offline discussion and perhaps answer some more of the questions and dig into your plans in a bit more detail. So just leaving 60 seconds for that, I would say we are now a minute over time. I hope the audience found that interesting and relevant. It felt like a really good conversation. There's really more to talk about, judging on the number of questions. So what remains to say is just to thank the panel. So thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Ben. And we will run more sessions and look forward to getting back online. But for now, we'll close the session here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate the time.
Thank you.